It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's Centre for Board and Director Development event as part of the university's Engage at Strathclyde Week. This is the first public activity of the Centre, and this comes after a period of extensive stakeholder engagement with board members from all industrial sectors and parts of the economy, from for-profit, from the government and also the third sector. And I'm aware that many of those stakeholders are attending today's webinar. So given that this is the first public event, it's probably important to say a little bit about the Centre for Board and Director Development and also why the university has decided to start one. There's a Greek aphorism from about the 4th century BC that essentially says that one of the most important things that a person can do is to know themselves, know their strengths, their weaknesses, the areas for future development, and the changes that need to be made to make you a better person. And although it's 2,500 years ago that this aphorism first came out, it applies today as equally as it does then. And it's also highly relevant for our companies and the boards that lead them, especially now as we move through COVID and out into a world that will be beset with technological change, societal change, environmental change, and also political change. And as a board member myself, I recognise that it's each and every one of our responsibilities of us who are on boards to ask ourselves these questions of ourselves as a board member, and also to ask those questions of our boards. What are our weaknesses? What are our strengths? And what do we need to do to make ourselves better directors and more highly efficient boards? So to this end, the university, Strathclyde Business School, and our academics and our corporate stakeholders from not just Scotland, the UK, but from all over the world, we've come together to create a new centre, a centre for board and director development that will facilitate this process of helping boards, helping directors know themselves. And we'll also bring our most up-to-date academic breakthroughs and approaches to help improve board and director performance. We're uniquely placed to do this as a university and as a business school, because not only is the business school one of the oldest and biggest business schools in Europe, but the university gives us our assets as well. We're part of a socially progressive, leading international technological university that's possibly one of the most well-linked and impactful in the UK. We only need to look at the Technology and Innovation Centre, the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation District Scotland, and the emerging Glasgow City Innovation District as evidence of our industry links and our impact. And I can't think of anyone better to launch this first event than Charlotte Valeur, who is internationally recognised for her clear thinking and the ability to ask the right questions of the many boards in which she sits and chairs. And so it's with this that I now pass on to Dr. Phil Considine, the Director of the Strathclyde Executive Education and Development, and also the Centre for Board and Director Development, to provide a formal introduction to Charlotte. Phil.
Many thanks, David, and thanks for that introduction. Just a couple of housekeeping points for everybody. So today's session is being recorded, and we will be sending out the recording to everybody over the course of the next couple of days. And also, if you have any questions for Charlotte, of which I'm sure there'll be lots as we go through, could you please use the Q&A function that we have on in the bottom of your screen. So if you use the Q&A function for any questions, it means that we can kind of curate the questions and that we can put them to Charlotte, just to make sure that all of your questions are dealt with. And yeah, it's really exciting for us to be launching today with Charlotte. So today's session we're running, it's in partnership with Global Governance Group, who Charlotte is one of the key individuals involved with that, along with her co-editor Claire, who I think is on, Claire Fargate, who I think is on today's webinar as well. And also we've had great support from the Institute of Directors in this session today, but also more in terms of the links that the centre is having and the work that we're doing. We're working very much in partnership with the Institute of Directors. So next we'll just have a kind of a little bit of an overview of the kind of work that we're going to be doing and what today's session is going to look like. So we will be with Charlotte for about 30-40 minutes where Charlotte's going to give her insights, and we'll then have plenty of time for questions and answers. We'll certainly be finished by 1:30 at the very latest, so we'll stick fairly rigidly to time because we know that everybody's busy. As David mentioned, the Centre for Board and Director Development is a relatively new centre that we launched about a month ago, and we've got a fantastic group of stakeholders that are involved with us. And we'll be running a series of events that will provide non-exec directors, chairs, trustees with practical insights into how boards can help create value in a post-COVID world. Anybody that registers for today will be given access to all of our future insights from the centre, and we've got one white paper that we've already produced on the back of a stakeholder event, so we'll make sure that everybody gets access to that. You'll get access to, as I say, to the recording of today's event and the answers to the questions, and also you'll be kept abreast of future events that we'll be running kind of over the course of the next 6 months or so. But we do have a really ambitious plan for the centre, and we will be running a significant number of programmes, of events. We have 3 work streams that we are focusing on, and we'll have a number of programmes. The next slide will show you some of our thinking on the programmes that we'll be running. We have some knowledge exchange events, and we have some thought leadership that we will be involved in. So when we think about the kind of programmes that we're going to be developing, we will have qualification programmes. So we will have postgraduate diplomas in governance. We're working very closely with the Institute of Directors on that. We will have exec development programmes that are non-qualification, but that we will use micro-credentials for. We have a series of thought leadership sessions planned, and we will be running another one in September, October time, but we'll kind of give you some more information around that, looking at what the key challenges that directors and chairs and non-execs are being faced with in kind of the current turbulent times. And we have got some really interesting thought leadership that is coming through, some of it based on work that people like Charlotte are involved in that are coming out of the books, and some of it that will give some really strong guidance to chairs, directors and non-execs that they can use to ensure that boards are effective, are as effective as they can be, and to help kind of create that post-COVID world. So the knowledge exchange, we're looking at how boards appraise, how we appraise and how we ensure that that boards are working effectively. We will be looking at, today kind of starts off some of the things on questions for board directors. And through our partnerships, we'll be developing some case studies and some practical guides for directors and non-exec directors. The next session that we're going to run, the next knowledge exchange event, we think will be around digital transformation and artificial intelligence and the CEOs, what CEOs have to understand around that. So we've got a series of very much applied, very practical and very practitioner-focused work streams that we'll be developing over the course of the next few months. And so we look forward to sharing more of them with you. So if I can move on now to introduce you to Charlotte. Charlotte, who will obviously be quite capable of giving a little bit of background herself, but Charlotte has got many years of experience. Charlotte started out as an investment banker in Denmark and in the UK, and she developed her chair and non-exec director experience through serving on a variety of boards. She has been a director of 8 public companies. She has been the chair of some very large global corporates. She has overseen significant mergers and acquisitions, and she currently chairs Blackstone Loan Financing. She was the chair of the Institute of Directors. Charlotte is a non-exec director on Lang O'Rourke and in the BT Pension Fund, and chairs the board of Apprentice. So in addition to writing really kind of thought-provoking and challenging books for practitioners. So a huge bank of experience and a huge bank of knowledge and understanding that we're absolutely delighted that we're able to tap into and work with Charlotte on this. So if I can now just pass you over to Charlotte, and very much looking forward to hearing Charlotte's thoughts. As I say, if you place in the Q&A any questions that you want us to put to Charlotte, we will curate them and get them over to Charlotte for her considered opinions on. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction. I hope I'm on the screen now. I'm not sure I can see I am, but I'll just keep talking on this. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about. I'm obviously delighted to be part of Strathclyde and the board centre, and also for having my company Global Governance Group part of that. This is how we collaborate, all of us, and spread best practice and share knowledge. I think those are some of the key points for me. When we collaborate more, all of us, we really do move forward in a much better way together. So today I'm going to talk about where the boards are falling short. Over the years, the specific last 15 years, where I have worked very closely with boards in different positions, both as a board member, but also doing board reviews and doing board advisory with various other people as well, on 3 different continents of the world. So with a wide range of different boards from different countries and cultures, you obviously pick up a thing or two as you go along. And what's quite interesting is that it's often similar things boards fall short of. And it hasn't actually necessarily changed too much. But the one I'm focusing on for this speech is the value creation that boards should be overseeing and should be part of. So if we can take the next slide, please. So the kind of areas are looking here. Obviously, I think we all know as directors that one of our key duties is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its stakeholders as a whole, and then provide the support to create long-term value. And it's the word value we want to focus a bit around, which obviously we built through the strategy that we're part of. But over the 15 years I've worked with boards, strategy has always been a bit of an issue. It's been a place where the boards were not entirely sure how to run this annual strategy days away, blah, 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 what even to talk about, and who forms the strategy, who forms the vision, what comes from the board, what comes from the executives. But we had a sort of old 2015 survey where we had 65% of board members agreeing that they didn't fully comprehend the company's strategies. I started in 2006, so this is sort of midway through why I started. 80% showed of directors were not completely aware of how their firms created value, and 85% didn't have a strong understanding of the dynamics of their firm's industries. So those are just a few strategic pieces, some of which sort of feeds directly into the value piece, but generally around strategy. And then we got to ask ourselves, has anything much changed since then? If I could have the next slide, please. I think the link with strategy that we have to talk about the strategy and value is, what value are we creating now and for the future? And I'm not hearing that coming onto the boards I've been exposed to and speaking to directors of other boards, coming specifically to the board as a question that they ask themselves and have the full clarity on. So there will be discussions around it, but do they really dig into it and ensure that they have that very clarity of value and who we are creating the actual value for. So a company is not an island in society, it's part of the whole. The only reason any organization can function in a country obviously is because there is an infrastructure. There are laws, there are roads, there are people. Without people, no organization has any reason for living. So the ultimate stakeholders obviously should always be seen as the world, the planet, the people in the world, because ultimately without them, no organization is anything. But of course, then you narrow it down from there to who are your suppliers, your employees, and all the different other stakeholders that are closer to heart. But I think at a high level, as directors, we need to be very clear that we have a place in society only because society exists. And I feel that that's often forgotten in the overall considerations that board members are having between them, that you can't just say, oh, we don't care about these people or those people or people in another world. I think if we think about the pandemic, for example, have we all in our solution seeking of the pandemic considered how the planet becomes free of the pandemic? Or have we focused on our own country or even our own company or our own family? You see how when you narrow things down more and more, you lose that bigger picture. The bigger picture is going to destroy all the other smaller pictures you have below that. I speak to a number of organizations in different African countries, and I can tell you the African countries have not got vaccines. They are suffering. Look at India in addition, suffering. And what are we in the West doing? We're talking about we are now over it and we can go out and meet our friends and meet up for meetings, not thinking about the part of the world that has not got what we have got. But in the end of the day, we are one part of one cell. And if we haven't got the ability to look at that holistic picture, we're just fooling ourselves that we are out of a pandemic that is almost starting in other countries and is creating new variants that we are potentially not vaccinated for. So until we start looking at the world as one planet, as one cell that we are all part of, we can't cure a small part of one cell. We have to cure the entire cell. And I think that is the kind of value discussions we do need to have also in organizations, because all organizations, as I said, are part of that bigger picture. So how do we create that value is also key. So for example, at a country level with the pandemic, some countries chose to say, well, as many vaccines as we use in our country, we will also use in other countries, so that they share equally. If they are wealthier, for example, Norway is doing that, then they pass out. And that is the way, if we all did that in the Western world, because we can afford to, because we haven't got equal distribution of wealth in the world, right? So if we share out in that way, both on a country level, but also on an organizational level, if one organization is fit and the next one is not, that could be one of your suppliers. And then that doesn't really help you at all, that you are when someone else is not. I think we have to start being very clear that if we don't support others and they therefore suffer from that, part of ourselves suffer and part of our organization will suffer. Again, I think if you look at the bigger picture with net zero, for example, so at Langewood Construction, we declared it will be net zero by 2050. And for example, we would be 50-50 gender balance in the construction company by 2030. So by 2050, to be net zero at tier 3, we have to ensure that our suppliers are also net zeros. We have many suppliers, right? We are a huge company doing very large infrastructure projects in especially the UK and Australia. We have many sub-suppliers, but we will have to look at them and their net zero strategy and what they have gone along the way with changing so that their pollution, if you want, carbon output is not destroying our net strategy. So everything that goes on in terms of pandemic and climate change is for all of us. It is not something we can do in a silo. And that is the kind of thinking that I think that boards and leaders are falling short of, and that we really do need to consider. So who is the interest that we are doing things in. Again, we're having a lot of discussion around stakeholder governance as opposed to shareholder governance. And this is another one where we really need to be very clear on who are our stakeholders. And again, ultimately, it's everybody. And then we have closer ones that we need to stay in closer touch with. But in the end of the day, it's the people of the world and the world itself that is our ultimate stakeholder, no matter what organization we're operating in. So it is in everybody's interest that we all do the right thing. Otherwise, we cannot face the kind of issues that's right in front of us and right here with us happening as we speak. And it feels a little bit as if the pandemic has shown us our shortfallings in a very big way. And we can take that down to the organizational level to see if that lack of understanding who are the bigger picture stakeholders and what value are we creating for the bigger picture, that flows through our entire organization and therefore also the culture. So you see, it touches in on a lot of things that we need to be very aware of as board members. So to what ends should we be thinking of these kind of things? Well, because if we don't do that, we are actually all doomed. We're not going to be one coming out of it well, whilst everybody else is not. With these global issues that affects everybody, we need to start thinking in the everybody kind of way and stop thinking from an ego level, from me and what's around me. And that feeds into what we heard in the beginning of this, that self-knowledge and awareness that we need to build, that the world is bigger than we and me. And the bigger self-orientation you have, the worse you will be. In fact, if you are leaders or are surrounded by leaders with a very high level of self-orientation or ego, that should be on the risk register, because that is incredibly undermining to not just you and your organization, but to the world around you as well, to which you're also accountable. So that feeds me into talking a little bit about valueism. Valueism is a term coined by Paul Barnett that I've known for years and discussed governance with for years with great pleasure. It's a concept where we're moving from capitalism to valueism, where it's not about the profit anymore. It genuinely is about the much broader picture of value that organizations create in the world and the impact they have for good and for bad. Obviously, we're now talking about value, so the positive impact that organizations have and how you make sure that you value that at the same level as financial impact, for example. Where we are going, as I just talked about, the suppliers to various companies, if they just focus on their profit, they might not go in and make the changes in the value chain with regards to global warming and their carbon output sufficiently to stay being a supplier to certain companies. So again, if we don't start valuing these things equal to the financial value, we will effectively, in the end, lose financial value. And it's shifting into that place where you can start looking at it as, if we are not clear on equal value to the environment, to the people, to the planet as financial, we will eventually erode the financial value of our own company. And also here, I do feel that boards fall short quite often in having that clarity and still fall back in the good old show me the money. I mean, I was a stock exchange trader back in the 80s and 90s. It was all about show me the money, and nobody thought about what impact do we have other than what money do we make. I mean, it's a very crude environment, obviously, to grow up in, but it taught me a lot about risk management and which things to look at. And if I was a trader today, I would certainly have a very keen eye in what broader value organizations would look at and boards would push for, and the strategic direction of the companies, knowing that if they didn't do the right thing, I should be downrating how much I would pay for their stock. I think that's a very clear direction that we're taking. And I think if you talk to any traders today, you will be aware that they certainly have that input. I'm chairing one of Blackstone's loan financing companies, for example, and at some stage, Blackstone might have to ask themselves, who will we lend money to? Who will we finance, as other banks should do, and any other group of capital market participants? If they are not showing that broader value, would we even want to finance them? So again, if you're not looking at your broader value beyond financial income, then you could find yourself paying a lot more for your finance, which in turn will touch the bottom line. So it's all interconnected, and this is where we really, really, really need to move on with this issue. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I wanted to just talk a little bit with this, because you should really have like a value framework or something that you work from to ensure that you drive your company or your organization in the right direction with the tone from the top. Obviously, you have to ensure that the tone from the top flows down to the tone from the middle, because the middle actually deals with a broader group of people within your organization. So we have many years talked about the tone from the top, but I think we need to also discuss the tone from the middle and ensure that that comes out in the right way. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are more and more the kind of things that on the boards I serve on and that I work with, that we look at as a guidance to what should our value structure be? How should we ensure that we create value in the right areas? And more so boards that I work with are reporting against this, and sort of ESG is part of reporting against the UN sustainability goals. And it's very important, I think, that we as a planet have one framework as far as we can that we report against, and we can all understand across different countries and continents, what are we doing towards ensuring that all of these 17 goals are being fulfilled, coming from the first level of biosphere, where you have the planet, the water, the basis for all of us to be alive. What are we doing with that? What is our organization doing with that? I'm not so sure these conversations are on the table, and they keenly need to come onto the table. Are we polluting anything? Why are we polluting? Who does it affect? How can we stop doing it? And you take the next level of the society, where all the different aspects that goes on in society and the social construct that we're working from, because let's face it, I mean, money is a social construct that we have created to make it easier for us to exchange services. But equality, diversity, access to education, all of these kind of things are absolutely key for us to also drive from the board level. We need to drive it through KPIs, through ensuring that, for example, the CEO is measured. Part of their bonus will be against how diverse are you and how equal is the organization, having proper feedbacks as from employees, but also from the broader stakeholders around how do you feel this is an equal company? Do you feel you have equal access to opportunities? What is the culture like? What does it feel like? Do you have any toxic leaders, for example? Those kind of things are something that will all feed in to creating a workplace for everyone that is inclusive and equal for everyone to succeed in. And then the last level we come into is the economic impact of everything and how we work, and we make sure that things work together. So this leads me into the next slide, please, which is just an example of one of the boards I serve on, NTR, which is a board of a company in Ireland. They are wind turbine or wind farm renewable energy developers. And they have basically set up the various sustainability goals that they feed into and how they feed into it. This is more and more the kind of reporting that I see. And to make this kind of reporting as a board, an executive group, you need to have those discussions for every single sustainability goal that will take you through the appropriate sort of thinkings and processes to get to a place where you can see what you're actually doing to meet the various goals. And this is the value creation that you have. You could actually add another line in it that specifics that you draw out that is measurable under each of them, because we do unfortunately have a lot of greenwashing going on, which is something we again have to be very aware about. As board members, we cannot approve or be part of anything where we say something that there hasn't got actions behind. It is deeds, not words, right? You have to put actions behind what you say you do. More and more so, what you say publicly is going to be audited one way or the other by various stakeholders, being it activists or even auditors are starting to look more and more at the verification of the actual actions that lie behind the statements you put out about the different values that you believe you and your organization are creating. And if there are no actual impact or actual measurable impact, you might well get picked up on that, which I think is something to be very mindful of. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is one of the systems that I look at when I look at boards and directors of where do they operate in terms of vertical leadership development and vertical thinking. This is not a new thing. This has been sort of started from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, moving into leadership development and how leaders view the world and how they operate in the world. So the first level, sort of the first three levels, the red, the orange and the yellow, is where about 80% of the world population operates, where we are now. You can look at this for individuals, for organizations, and for countries, because it's a development that everybody goes through. And there are lots of research under something called spiral dynamics that also show these kind of levels, and much deeper, sort of deeper research around why it is the way it is and how it functions. It is said that millennials come in at the green level, which, as you can imagine, means that my age and above operating at the yellow, orange and red levels might find it difficult to communicate with another generation that operates at the green level. And therefore, we can have conversations that very much goes past each other like this, and is not very helpful. But as millennials and younger are coming in to become more than 50% of the world population, we're going to be overridden very shortly. They're going to be the talent, the voters, the buyers, everything that we want to interact with. They're going to be representing that. So it is time where directors from sort of 40 and up needs to look long and hard at their own self-development, and as was mentioned earlier, but at their own cognitive development in terms of why, asking more self-searching, why am I this or that or the other, or why are we doing this? Lots of whys, and start questioning maybe some of your set ways of being. You can sort of look at a board that will still saying, why do we need diversity? And you know that you're operating on yellow, orange and red, because that's where you ask those whys, because you're still driven by self-orientation or ego, and it sort of starts with your own comfort rather than that of the broader world. But when you go into green and blue, you don't really ask why anymore on something like diversity and equality. You just ask the how. How do we do it? You are cognitively developed to a level where you understand that it is necessary. It is a necessary part to make the right decisions, that you have many different sets of eyes on the decisions and within the decision-making process. And I think we are moving to a level where that broader understanding is there. We are still having resistance. We're still having resistance. We haven't even reached a parity in gender, which shows we're still having resistance, because people cognitively don't actually grasp what it is the world needs today. The problem we are in front of is that if we are not operating at greens or turquoise and blues, we won't be able to resolve the problems the world is heading towards or is already in, because we will resolve them from red, yellow and orange, which is just not good enough for the entire world. And we have indeed, in my view, resolved the pandemic, I don't think it's resolved, work with the pandemic from level red, orange and yellow, and therefore we are still in problems, right? That this pandemic is not going anywhere as long as we have entire continents in the world not having access to vaccines. And if we think it is, and we can do it without that, we are fools, right? And we shouldn't. We should be more developed than that. We should understand that we are all part of one cell. And this is really key for me. The last year and a half, I've been talking about this in almost all the speeches I've had, because I feel a huge sense of urgency in getting the understanding out, all of us together, to embrace the knowledge that if we don't develop, we're not able to embrace valueism. We're not able to embrace the world and the problems we have in front of us, because we simply cognitively are not developed well enough to do that. That could end up, let's say we don't change any of that, we are very likely to end up in wars over food, over land, over resources, because as we get climate change happening and land disappearing into the waters, we will have less space with more people on, which inevitably will end up in us fighting around the resources. So if we do end up in wars, which I I honestly hope we won't, because it will be our children and grandchildren who will have to fight those wars based on the decisions we make today. But if we do end up in wars, we will benefit from going back down to all the way to the red level, which is where you are more in survival instinct, and the kind of behaviors you need to show for survival operates at the red level. So all the levels are needed in the world, but what we need are at least for leaders to be green and blue and turquoise, so that they know what is needed right now, but they can also walk back down the ladder, if you want, should another sort of situation occur that takes into account basic survival. Because we can only go up by taking one step at a time, but once we walked up, we can go back down because we've been through the other levels and we understand how they work, and therefore we can switch back down when we need to. But hopefully we will all develop further up so that we can in fact fully embrace what is in front of us in terms of climate change and pandemics, because it's not the last one we're having, right? So if we could have the next slide, please. I've just put a few, and I'm really sorry, this is very small. I think you will all get the slides and can therefore see it after. But some of the questions that you should be asking in the boardroom would, like, who are our stakeholders? Have a good conversation about that. Again, I see too few boards having proper conversations about who stakeholders are. Who do the board speak to? Who do the executives speak to? How do we create value for them as seen from their perspective, not from our perspective? Do we know their perspective of it? Do we know what the appropriate KPIs are in that connection? And how do they compare to the KPIs we use today? What do we need to change to get into that different thinking? Do we have the ability to ensure that we understand how we perform in relation to valueism? I mean, if we don't have to even the ability to think about valueism, how can we then ask the right questions? Do we need to rethink our reporting approach in relation to valueism? Are we reporting in the wrong way? Should we consider something completely different, a different framework? How can we map our value creation scheme to see how it operates as a system? Do we even have a value creation scheme? So these are all of the interesting questions that we should all be considering and that you will all be given so you can see it. In that connection, if we can move to the next slide, we, myself and Claire Farshow have just pre-launched a book where there is about the right questions to ask. Valueism is one chapter in this book. There is a website called qta.world where you can sign up if you want. It's open access. It's free to download globally. It was very important for us that we offered a tool to the world that was a collaboration between a list of experts in different areas. We have 54 different subjects or chapters, if you want, each about 2,000 words. That gives an introduction and then outlines the 20 key questions boards should ask. And this is set up in such a way that is for any country and any organization anywhere in the world. And we hope you will enjoy that once you can get access to it. It's set to be, we're pushing for September, but our publisher is saying it might be October, but we'll do what we can to get it in sooner rather than later. And that's all for me for today. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a real joy.
Perfect. Fantastic, Charlotte. Many thanks for that. As you can imagine, we've got lots and lots of questions that have been coming through and that are still coming through on both the Q&A and on the chat as well. It's good to see that our instructions were slavishly followed. So can I start then just by putting some of the questions to you, Charlotte, just to get your thoughts on them. So the first one that we've got here is, do you think that the inability to understand value links to many boards not being clear on company purpose? So that their inability, so where boards aren't, where they don't understand what they mean by value, does that link to their a lack of clarity around company purpose?
I absolutely think it does. I mean, purpose and values are very, very closely linked together. And I think if you don't know what your purpose for your company is, I mean, even if it's as crude as to put money in the pocket of someone, but generally, or hopefully, there should be a slightly deeper purpose than that. It is absolutely interlinked, yes. And purpose discussions is also something that we seem to struggle with on boards and actually agree on. Why are we even alive? Why is this organization alive? Why does it, what well, yeah, what's its purpose in society, in the world, in for our stakeholders? Absolutely, very, very key discussion to have.
So in boards that you've been involved in, then where have you seen these conversations being, very well developed, and what is it about those examples that you think that those organisations managed to have a clarity around value? What differentiates them with some of the organisations that don't?
I have to say, so one of the companies, Valeur Construction, that I'm on board of, they are a really, really good example of a company who understands the purpose. Ray Rook, who's the CEO and who created this company over 40 years ago with his brother, has very strong values and drives things very, very clearly towards specific aims. He wants to ensure that the construction industry moves into the next century. They are pushing for construction to be much more sort of off-site manufacturing based, to reinvent the entire construction industry. That is the overriding purpose that he drives, and is therefore the whole organization is ahead of the game in many ways, which is why we get very large projects such as Hinkley Nuclear Power. We've done 4 out of 5 hospitals for the UK over the last couple of years, and really large infrastructure projects. We are very clear as an organization on why we exist and what we want to change in the world. They were very brave coming out to say, we're going to have 50-50 gender balance by 2030, right? This is a construction company with over 5,000 employees. And I might add, there is a majority of men in that construction company currently. So over the next 9 years, which is not much if you think about how long it's taken us to get 25% women on board, right? About what, 100? Or what are we talking about? Right? So if you in 9 years want to change the construction organization, we had lots of discussions around it, good discussions around it, whether it was too ambitious or not. But when you are out there first, you can actually attract that talent because you show how committed you are to equality, to getting a balance, to doing things, and you have the whole workforce behind you. So this is a really strong thing that many organizations could benefit from doing.
Yeah, brilliant.
Excellent. It's beautiful when it works, right? Yes, and then you have other where you have really difficult conversations and you just cannot even agree on what's our reason for being here, right?
Yeah. And that kind of really strong link then when you have from the absolute top of the organisation a clarity of and a vision as well around the kind of levels that are around what the organisation is, what its purpose is, why it's there. Brilliant. Okay, so the next question I've got here is about how do we persuade boards to value effective preventative activities? I think this is linking back to your conversation around stakeholder strategy and kind of expanding that to a planetary scale. How do we persuade boards to value effective preventative activities, whether they're on the risk register or not, when they can't measure the financial impact of something that didn't happen? And I know that in some areas in government, they'll often mention or they'll talk about counterfactuals. But so how do they measure some of these counterfactuals, these activities that didn't happen? Is this an area where boards tend only to purchase insurance because they're obliged to, or should they be doing this because they want to?
So hoping I understand the questions right, to measure the effects that didn't happen. Yeah. I think, again, with measurements and also risk, when you measure risk, you also have to look at opportunities. So opportunities are also things that didn't happen, right? Yeah. And if you have opportunities in front of you that you don't grab hold of, that is a risk as well. That is a huge risk because it can take your organization out and not make it develop in the direction it should if you continue to lose opportunities. I think it's hard to measure at times because how do you know what you could have made of an opportunity you didn't take? But I think this is where you have to have scenario analysis. You have to have scenario analysis around different things. The board has to ask for that of the executives to say, well, these kind of things could, they have to have enough interest as a board to actually do it. And I think what I was hoping with the questions to ask book was that executives could also use that to bring the answers to questions that was never asked to the table. Do you see what I mean? So actually to understand what should be asked in a boardroom, even if they have a fairly passive board that might not ask the questions, they as an executive can enhance the organization by then bringing the answer to questions that should be asked to the board, even if they haven't asked the questions. As executives, I don't think we always have to wait for the board to ask the question. We can ideally and should ideally be proactively, because that's what we're paid for, right? Proactively bringing the things that brings the organization closer to everything they need to do and to the broader value system, and also ensure that we understand that the things that didn't happen would have impacted us in this and this and this way. Does that make sense? I think that.
No, absolutely it does. And I remember a few years ago doing some work with one of the banks who had a kind of very strong ethical policy around activities that they would get involved in, and they would add up and count up the value of business that they turned away, and they were very clear that they could add up and count the value of business turned away, but also by then engaging more with their stakeholders, they could calculate the added value that they got from turning that away. So I mean, I think that there are, it's always, as you say, it's difficult, isn't it?
It can be, but you have to try to think of the measurements for all the different non-financial values. And I think we're going to be more inventive as we go along to understand how to measure differently. How many hours have we delivered training? What is our happiness level with our staff, for example? Like we even do that on contra basis. We have these happiness. Apparently the Danes are the happiest in the world continuously. For whatever reason, we love paying tax. I don't know. But I think it's a cultural thing. And you will have the same cultural thing going on within your organization, that when you contribute to something, and for example, there's some research around when you are more inclusive in an organization, it makes your employees happier. So when you're inclusive of, for example, neurodiversity, one of my other passions, obviously, when you actually create sort of universal tools that makes it possible for example, neurodiverse people to be more included in the workplace, everyone else becomes happier too. And especially Microsoft has done some work in that, and it just is that way. When you are more inclusive, everyone is happier. Yeah. Even the ones who doesn't need you to be more inclusive, right? But they become happier too.
No, absolutely. And I think as we're getting kind of better at reporting, we're doing some work just now with one of the energy companies on social return on investment, and on social impact and on environmental impact. And actually, I think we are developing toolkits that allow us to just get a flavour of the impact that we're having. And it doesn't always have to be measured in kind of pounds and pence.
But eventually it becomes that too, if you don't fulfill it. And I do think we need to start thinking as for example, sustainability, and also where we are as a in sort of a vertical development. We have to take that into our discussion on strategy, to our discussions on stakeholder engagement and communications, to our risk register. It's not something you do separately in its own box. It's something that is part of every single conversation you have. Every single point on the agenda has those parts in it, and you have to get that into the conversation in every single one. It's not something you do separately at the end of the meeting, right?
No, absolutely. Okay, here's another question. This is taking us in a slightly different direction, but one that I know that you are hugely kind of passionate about, is that when you talked about inclusion and many boards lack diversity, and some groups, such as minority ethnic people, are underrepresented at all levels. What is holding boards back from overcoming this and maximising the benefit to their organisations? I think you kind of touched on that just where you mentioned neurodiversity there as well.
It is that what has been in my brain for years. I've been working very hard on boards in this for almost 15 years now. And that is why I got so into the whole vertical development, because I actually think that's what's holding it back. It's a cognitive inability to understand. I mean, we have cognitively developed as human beings over, just look at the last 500 years, right? I mean, 500 years ago, it was literally okay to burn people on the fire, right? Especially women. And it was, nobody even questioned it. At some stage, we started questioning that. And we evolved to another understanding of, let's not treat human beings in that way. So 100 years ago, we literally thought it was okay that women didn't have voting rights, right? And then now we look back and we go, wow. But I mean, what is it? 30 years ago, we thought it was okay to make it illegal to be within LGBTs, right? Illegal. And that we had programs to reprogram them to become normal, right? I mean, this is not very long ago. So this is all connective sort of a cognitive development steps that we take. And I think we are in front of a major shift again to come into this other level of understanding. And we might look back in 20 or 30 years to where we are today and go, wow, really? I mean, even in neurodiversity, I'm keenly looking into the kind of treatments they do, especially with autistic people, being autistic myself. And this ABA training they do is literally abuse, right? It is literally child abuse. And we have private equity companies invested in it. Again, in another 10 or 20 years, they're going to look back and go, wow, that was not great. I mean, we're almost talking human rights issues here, right? So that is all about cognitive development. So we are sort of sneaking up the steps a little bit all the time. But I just think that we need more urgency. We need more urgency on that cognitive development to understand the why, right? We shouldn't be asking why. I can't even have conversations with people who say, why should we have gender balance, right? Because I'm just like, sorry, I just go and Google it. There's enough research out there. But I think if we can push in and just demand discussions at another level, just about how do we do it? And this is why I launched Board Apprentice, to get the boards to actively take part of developing those diverse board members. And if you have an all, so this is a bit crude maybe, right? But if you have an all-white board, taking 2 board apprentices in of ethnic minority, they have actually they've got practical field training in diversity and inclusion by having 2 board apprentices sitting in that room for a year. And that practical training, there is some evidence to show that it affects the board's own way of understanding that it is not that dangerous or different or such a problem. It is literally just other human beings that happen to have another color of skin. But actually, in the end of the day, we're all human beings. That's why we need to go. We need to just get to the level where we all respect each other as human beings on an equal basis, right? We might be something more momentarily if we get a position, right? So I become chair of the Institute of Directors and suddenly people behave differently to me, which I thought that's weird, but actually it's not that weird because that's what people do, right? And then the position goes away again and then we are, back to good old whatever it was before. Great, but we need to understand we might get a position that might make us feel momentarily like a king or a queen, but we're not. The position is, it's not us. We're just a human being fulfilling something that we have created, right? Sorry, that was a long answer to that.
No, not at all. And I guess it kind of picks back up as well on a point that you made earlier, where you were talking about in organisations that do have a stronger sense of inclusivity and where they have got a stronger sense of neurodiversity within the organisation, that the staff that aren't part of that group are happier. Yeah. Therefore, as a board, if you're doing it, it kind of makes sense that as a board member, you're going to be happier, you'll be more fulfilled, and as you say, you are actually getting practical, live practical development in areas that you weren't otherwise being able to get.
You learn, right? It's only through someone disagreeing with us that we have an opportunity to grow. Yeah. When everybody agrees with us, we learn nothing new. Yeah. When someone disagrees, we have to go deeper in. And so quite diverse boards tend to have longer discussions. They turn more stones and they speak up. in different ways. And we learn so much through that. It's a much richer conversation, and our decision-making process is better. It is a bit longer, but it's better.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. So I've got a question here. It's an interesting question about, it's linked to the energy sector, but it's asking a question about in the UK recent energy white paper. So the government chose to use the market to set the long-term energy mix. Does a national competitive market approach to delivering globally important long-term outcomes encourage or undermine board ability to pursue valueism? So I think that the kind of the question here is that if we leave it to the market, are we likely to pursue valueism, or are we likely just to satisfy that market?
I think we have to have some nationally set goals and internationally. This is why I personally like the UN sustainability goals, because it gives something for the world to agree on and that we are moving towards. I mean, if we think about it, yeah, I mean, as a planetary issue, I think that the free market powers only work so far, right? Because they tend to be driven by self-orientation. We haven't really got that many countries where it's not. Some of the Scandinavian countries might have moved closer to this broader, it's about all of us, and the social aspect is as important as the monetary aspect, which is why they all don't mind paying more taxes, because it goes for the better of everybody. When you don't have poor people begging in the streets, you have a better time walking down the street, right? And you know that everybody is looked after and cared for. It still makes me incredibly uncomfortable to see people in the street having to beg for the basics. For me, that's just intolerable. But it's something that we can look at and then try to change. But we can't do that if our self-orientation is too big. And it's also through self-orientation that we undermine trust, right? When you have businesses operating very much for their own means, it's very hard for the public to have trust in that business. And I see, so I have 3 teenage children, especially my daughter is very up on everything sort of planetary and environmental. And there's many things. There's a group making bikinis that she loves those bikinis, but they are not made in a sustainable way, so she will not buy them. But she would love to have one. She said, I wish that they could just become sustainable, then I would buy it. But it just is too hard for me to support anything that isn't. This is where we're going. But until we get there, I do think we need national goals, we need international goals. Just a small thought, if we do have visitors from outer space, who is going to speak on behalf of all of us? Which leader would we choose? And why and how? We need to be clear on who speaks for us as a planet. Are we clear on that? And should we as leaders be pushing more to make sure we have that clarity? Would we like president of one country to speak? I mean, no, not in my world, but maybe the UN or any other similar organization where all the world can come together behind it is that one. I think we have to think bigger. As leaders, we've got to be able to think big, not tiny, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, we're doing okay time-wise. I think we'll get time for another kind of 2 or 3 questions, I think, before we wrap up. So this next question is it's getting back round to your questions to ask, and it's kind of taking us back to that focus on as directors, how you behave in board meetings. So the question is, what do you suggest a board member does when his or her questions are dismissed or not answered in a timely manner, not just in one instances, but you know, when you spot a pattern of this?
Yeah. So first, obviously, you want to make sure that your questions are logged in the minutes. If it's been asked in the board meeting, it's in the minutes. And you make sure that every single time you ask that, the next time you haven't had a reply to it, you bring it to the next board meeting, refer back to already having asked it, and then ask it again. And you continue to do that. And then you will have your audit trail of the pattern that is going on with this. And then ideally say to the board, I have now asked this question X times. I need an answer to it. Is that something we can all agree on? If it then shows that you are in a minority and it's very important for you and you can't tolerate being in a minority, then you leave the board, because that is the only last thing you can do. Otherwise, you stand behind questions not being answered. So for me, it's very clear that of course there will be cases ongoing where you're in a minority, which doesn't matter if it's small things, and you can come behind it, because once a majority of a board you are director of makes a decision, whether you agree or not, you are in that decision. For example, I had a board some years ago where we agreed, the majority of the board agreed to follow the UN sustainability sort of ethical investment principles. And one board member was convinced from his point of view that the UN is a corrupt organization that he didn't want anything to do with. So we said, well, it might be, but we like the principles. We don't think so. We like the principles, so we're making this decision. He then wanted specifically in the minutes to note that he was in disagreement with that. And I said, we can't do that, but you have to come behind the decision that we have taken as a majority of the board. And if you cannot do that, you have to consider your position on the board. And he then said, I'm resigning then on the basis that. I said, that's fine, and I understand that, because you feel so strongly about it that you can't come behind it. You cannot stay in and just obstruct, right? You have to then resign, and you can then put in your resignation letter the reason why you resigned and why you couldn't stand behind that. So you also have that as an audit trail. That would be what I would do.
Right, yep, brilliant, thanks. You mentioned there's a couple of questions coming in here around this notion of the millennials that you talked about in the spiral dynamics model. There was also a couple of questions, Charlotte, just saying, could we get the reference for that, the spiral dynamic model? Was that from the book?
Yes, yeah. There is a book called Spiral Dynamics by Beck and Conan, I think they're called. So if you Google spiral dynamics, it will come up with the people who did it. Before that, there was an author called Graves who did the basics and started some memes like for the different colors that the two next chaps then, that was back in the 50s or 60s, that they have then built on to develop this spiral dynamics.
Brilliant. We'll put a reference in before we send out the...
There's also a book called Spiral Dynamics in Action. That's also very interesting too.
Perfect, thanks. So you mentioned millennials coming in higher in the spiral dynamics model. Could you expand a little bit more about how we can bring in more age diversity to our boards? And do you have kind of direct experience of this?
Yes, absolutely. It was very interesting. I had a board we were interviewing for, and I said, I want generational diversity as well as ethnic diversity. We need just different people. So everyone we interviewed below 40, the conversation was completely different. They talked about purpose, impact, and values. And that was all the questions, no matter what I asked them, it came back with those words in it. When I interviewed sort of over 50, the 40s are sort of in between. They can sort of fall either way. But the over 50s, none of those words were mentioned, none of them. It was very clear. If you try that, any one of you, if you try to have interviews where you have those different generations, you will find that the conversations are markedly different between the under 40s and the over 50s, and the 40s can fall either way. It is absolutely, you can go out tomorrow and start having an experiment like that. But they have also done research around it within spiral dynamics, actually, where they asked various questions to see what fits into the different colors. And they found that millennials, pretty much all of them fitted into the green, blue, and turquoise in the way they answered questions. Yeah. So it's a hugely interesting area, one that I think will expand, and one that we will all look at a lot more, because you cannot just teach directors how to be directors without trying to figure out what color they operate from. And even as a CEO, if you try to observe your board and find out what color do they operate from, try to find out what color do I operate from, and then see how they compare. And I can almost guarantee you, if you as a CEO operate at a color below where the board operates, you lose your job, right? But if it's the other way around, you can manage the board in a much better way, because you can move up and down the ladder. But if you're below, you just cannot move up until you work on yourself.
Right, yeah. And that kind of ties back in as well to some of the activist investor stuff that we're seeing from people like Larry Fink, and what they're saying around unless as a board you are dealing with these really, really important global issues, we will look to remove you as a director, or we will disinvest in your organisation. We'll certainly not.
Or they will disrupt. Or disrupt. Even if they're not invested, they can disrupt a lot with all kind of action through the government or through not-for-profit movements, all kind of things. I mean, we just really need to have a very open mind to the entire population. I mean, even little things. What we had Tesco a little while back, where the chair of Tesco said something very unfortunate about white men being endangered species in the boardroom, despite the fact that they still occupy 80% of the positions. There was a huge backlash, public activism on social media, blocked Tesco. They must have lost millions in turnover because people stopped going into Tesco's, at least for a period of time, whilst people were still enraged with it. So as board members, we have to be incredibly clear on what messages we bring out there. And if we operate at red, yellow, or orange, the chances are we will bring messages out that are unsuitable to where our stakeholders are if we have clients that are, for example, younger people, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think kind of tied to that, you had mentioned that traders are now downgrading stock because companies don't have clear strategic direction and broader value drivers. And as I say, we can see it, we do see it in some of the reports that are being launched, and some very, very, very clear direction that's been given by asset managers.
Absolutely, and rating agencies as well. So global investors is what I've worked with for years through capital markets, and how they make their various allocations. I'm still in touch with them because for governance they're very important. They are very concerned with this and really do want to understand where the boards are making impact or not. And if they feel they're not making impact, you will see AGM action, right? And the same with even if you're not a listed company, but you still have stakeholders, for example, people giving you finance, they're going to start looking at stuff like that. So let's just shape up together, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, I think we'll get time for 2 more questions, and then we will kind of we'll draw this to a bit of a halt. So we've got one here, just a question that kind of seems to link to these points that we're making, which saying, would you recommend direct representation of employees, 1 or 2 directors elected by employees for employees on the board for bottom-up communication and better transparency, or are there better ways of doing it?
So I love that question, Mike. You know I love that question because it's quite a thing for me around employee engagement with boards and how to get them to boards. So when I grew up in Denmark, this was already done by law. We always have over a certain amount of staff, you will have staff representation at board level, and it's elected by the staff or the employees. So it's not by board. I've had recently discussions with other chairs of UK companies, and there are really companies doing some great work around that and putting employees on boards. For example, Capita, as a FTSE 100 company, is doing just that. And I think you can read about that in the annual report if you want to have a look. And they have done pretty well in actually appointing 2 employees as non-executive directors, but they appointed them as opposed to them being elected. So I'm going to be looking into how can we learn from what they've done in other countries? How can we have a step-by-step development that, for example, UK boards and other country boards can be comfortable with, as opposed to going straight to let's have employees straight on boards. When I hear people talk about it, I still say, oh no, we're not talking about workers on board. What is this word workers? So what's the difference between workers and employees? Isn't that one and the same? Or are we calling it workers just to make it very clear that they're not board members? I mean, again, we have to be a bit careful with our language here. So can we not say workers on board? Can we just say employees, because that's what they all are? And actually, who are we to say that someone who traditionally might be regarded as a worker can't bring value to a board? through asking questions that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves, and coming from a different background. I mean, I happen to be the daughter of a butcher, and I thought my dad had a lot of interesting insights that I could learn from. And generally, I would say I always expect that anyone who's in front of me knows something that I don't know. I'm not so arrogant that I think I know more than everyone or anyone. So I think step by step, it could be first like a sub like committee or a board underneath or something like that with employees on. It could be going the full and appointing employees as non-execs. It could be having employee groups where they could come up as for election. But all of this, I think we have to start also considering development of employees as board members as part of the toolbox that you have in your employer sort of development, attraction, retention, training thing, whatever the different companies call it.
Right, brilliant. Okay, and I think we'll just finish on a very practical question then that we've got here, which is what can we do as non-exec directors to influence the dynamics of board discussions beyond the transactional KPI-based orientation? The bandwidth for thinking is holistic and future orientations a significant challenge. So what can non-exec directors do to influence that?
Well, ask the right questions. I mean, that's a good first start. I actually think about what conversation would I like to have here, and how can I, through questioning, tease that conversation out. This is something you learn if you're a mediator. You would know how to bring questions in that will take people on a journey, if you want, in the right direction. So I would do that through questioning, because that's much more open than if you start just putting statements out there to say, could we consider this, or could, and then make sure that it turns into a conversation that you can maybe build a decision-making process on top of, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a kind of really good place for us to end it, Charlotte, because when you're saying that, it would be about having the right questions to ask. Do you know of any books that will be coming out that would give directors a guide as to the questions that they might want to ask in the boards?
I'm bored to repeat my own book, right? Because you know what, it came from all the boards I've worked with and trained of directors and stuff, and it was always the piece I had at the end that said, these are questions for the board to consider. They always wanted more copies of, people came back to it again. I thought, why are we not just bringing it together in a book? It's so simple. It is out there. You can sort of get, questions to ask in this area or that area, but nobody had pulled it together into one place as a reference book. And that's what I wanted to do. And with that, we're going to build a lot more books below that, because it's just really useful. And it's collaboration between experts from different areas, and we're all sharing our knowledge. So the serious questions to ask will be growing every year with new books.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Charlotte, so first of all, a huge thanks for all of your time today and for just giving us the benefit of the experience that you have. We've got a number of questions that either are broadly answered by some of the other points that we made, or that we haven't quite managed to get around to. So what we will do with that is we will pull them all together, and anything that we didn't get answered, we will kind of do some written points to that we will send out to everybody. For everybody that's on the call today, I mean, please do keep in touch with us. There are a whole range of activities that we're going to be involved in, but the Centre for Board and Director Development is about co-creation of thinking. It's about co-creation of activities and programs, and it is very much about getting input from directors as to what the challenges that they're facing are. So please do keep in touch with us. As I say, but by dint of registering for this, you will be sent invitations for future activities and for future meetings that we're holding. We will be sending a note out this week for that will give you some additional information, and that as soon as the recording's available, we'll send an edited version of it to you. And finally, a huge thanks to the Institute of Directors for sharing this activity with their members and for future activities that we do. But as I say, most of all, thanks to Charlotte and to Claire, who I know is here somewhere, and we can't see, who has obviously worked really, really closely with Charlotte to get the book ready and the book out. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next event that we have, which, as I say, I think will be in early autumn. So on that note, we will take our leave and say thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.